So there's several things I want to talk about. I love your work. Um, and the first one, I know that you famously coined uh, the term and I suppose the idea of irreducible complexity. Um, could you give us a little bit of an explanation of what that is?
Yes, irreducible complexity, it sounds pretty fancy, but it just stands for something simple. And that is that a lot of systems, especially machines, need multiple components in order to work. And in my book, I used as an example from our everyday world, a standard ordinary mousetrap, mechanical mousetrap. And mechanical mousetrap usually has a number of parts, got a wooden base that um, all the other parts are attached to. It's got a usually a tightly wound metal spring, and that has extended ends that push against the platform and against another metal part, which is called the hammer, which is the part you pull over, and when you let it go, it can squash the mouse. But there's also a couple things that'll keep it in position until the mouse comes along. And I pointed out that Darwin said that his theory had to work by improving systems by numerous successive slight modifications. And he always insisted on that because he said that evolution had to be gradual, because if things improved quickly and in large leaps, then it would look suspiciously as if something other than chance mutations were involved. And I asked, well, or I pointed out that irreducibly complex systems can't be built gradually, or it's real tough to see how they can, because the function isn't there until pretty much the whole thing is complete. So a mousetrap, if you just start out with a wooden platform, it's not going to catch any mice. If you throw down a spring that's not connected to anything, it's still not going to catch any mice. You've got to have everything pretty much in place before it works. And so therefore, it's not easy to see. And nobody, not only me, but nobody I've come across in 25 years has been able to explain how you could build something like a mousetrap by numerous successive slight modifications. And the relevance to life is that modern science has discovered that the molecular foundation of life is run by molecular machines, literally machines made out of molecules. And like a mousetrap, and like pretty much any other machine you come across, they have a lot of different parts that are needed. And if you don't have the correct parts in the correct place, it doesn't work. And so again, it's hard to see how they could be built by Darwin's mechanism.
So one of the most common rebuttals I think I've seen to irreducible complexity is people claiming that sort of these mechanisms are they're they're becoming the mousetrap over time, but previous to that, they weren't used in the mousetrap function. And for instance, I think the most common example people talk about is the one where I forget who it was, but he said he used the mousetrap as a tie clip when it was
Yeah.
missing the hammer, so on and so forth. So what do you say in response to that? That it's not necessarily that these parts were made to function as a mousetrap originally, but over time as it became more complex, it turned into a mousetrap.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've heard that objection since 1996. And I think the man you're thinking of is named Ken Miller, who's a professor of biology at Brown University. Yeah, he said that, well, I can use part of the mousetrap as a tie clip, or in general, as you say, the parts could have been done, could have started out doing something else. But in the book itself, in Darwin's Black Box, I addressed that objection. I says, well, okay, suppose you went into your garage and you wanted to build a mousetrap, you might say, well, I have this piece of a plank. I can use that for the wooden base. Okay. And you put it down. But the problem is it doesn't work as a mousetrap. And you say, well, here's a grandfather clock and it's got a spring inside it. Maybe I can use that as the spring for the mousetrap. And again, the problem is, well, that it's still not working as a mousetrap. And with each part, you see that you still have to get all of them together before it works. So it's not that, a piece over here and a piece over here could be co-opted as the jargon goes. It's that they all have to be assembled and put in place before it works. And so that doesn't work anymore. And I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a common objection that you hear, because I've been hearing it since 1996, and I addressed it and I answered it in 1997, and nobody paid any attention. Or the other guys just don't deal with it. They bring up the same objections, year after year, decade after decade. So just last year, the Discovery Institute, which is a pro-intelligent design think tank, which I'm a part of, we collected all of my answers to critics from over the past several decades and put them together in a book called A Mousetrap for Darwin. And so I hope that people who hear objections to my arguments will go there first and see if I've addressed it over the years. And turns out I've addressed lots and lots of these arguments.
Yeah, I have seen that you have responded to that, and the rebuttals I see to irreducible complexity seem to have not gotten much more complex over the years.
Yeah. Yeah, just as it's funny. Yeah, it's apparently the go-to arguments for Darwin's theory haven't changed much since Darwin, because critics, right after he wrote Origin of Species, pointed out that if you have complex organs like the vertebrate eyeball, they need lots of parts. You can't see how that would be put together, and it's extremely sophisticated. And Darwin said, yeah, well, what if you had just a little cell or a little spot that had was light sensitive? He didn't explain how that could be. He didn't know anything about cells or molecules. But he says, well, if you have that and then somehow it gets into a little depressed region, now maybe light coming from one side would cast a shadow on the other side, and the creature could tell which direction the light was coming from. He said, well, if you start doing that and you start filling it with a gelatinous material, maybe you've got the beginnings of a lens. And he went over that until he's convinced himself and that maybe it could make an eye. But that was in, in the middle of the 1800s. And if you go today and ask yourself, okay, after all of this enormous progress by science and biology in the intervening years, now we can clone genes, now we can, make vaccines for viruses in split seconds, it seems. How have people filled in that argument? And it turns out they will say, if you ask, yeah, how about the eye? They'll say, yeah, well, suppose you start with a little light sensitive spot. And they give you the exact same argument that Charles Darwin gave in the 19th century. So we've got great science. We have 21st century science, which is wonderful in terms of what it can do and how it has elucidated the molecular underpinnings of life. But in terms of how it came about, we're still stuck with a 19th century theory that hasn't improved and in many ways has gone very, very quickly backwards in the intervening time.
Hmm. So I wanted to make sure the viewers understand. Can you sort of lay out what the implications are of irreducible complexity?
Sure, there's a few. The one that gets the most attention is that it kind of stymies Darwin's mechanism of how evolution might work. He always proposed that, well, if a creature was born that had some variation that somehow improved its ability to survive, then it would, but the odds would be good that it would survive and have more opportunities to leave more offspring. And if the offspring inherited that variation, then more of the next generation would have it too. And after a few generations, maybe the whole population would have it. And so now it's the regular feature, not a variation. And then if another variation came along and improved things, well, you could repeat the same scenario forever. But the problem is that it's not just a variation and improvement. You've got to build specific structures. And many of the structures in life, just like many of the machinery of our everyday world, is complicated and has a lot of different parts. And so the irreducible complexity very strongly resists these explanations, these Darwinian explanations. If you're serious about an explanation, you always have to remember that Darwinists don't look too closely at their explanations, and they have a much, much lower standard of evidence than other people do. So the most sophisticated, the best, the most highly investigated theory that science has produced for how life may have evolved or gotten its feature is utterly incapable of explaining things. So before Darwin, of course, most everybody in the world, and probably most everybody in the world still thinks that life was purposely designed. And since then, scientists and other folks dismiss that conclusion as, oh, that's, you're just wishing, it's just like you're hoping that there's a God and that this will explain it. But as I write in my books, I try to emphasize that coming to a conclusion of intelligent design is an empirical conclusion. We decide that things were designed all the time based on their physical properties. That mousetrap that you come across, if you saw it for the first time, you would quickly conclude it was purposely designed, because in the dictionary, a definition of design is the purposeful arrangement of parts. That is, when you take a part and you put it here and you match it with one over here, and you're putting these things together because you have a purpose for them to fulfill. It's usually pretty obvious to us folks that these parts have been arranged. And the reason is that minds, consciousnesses, we can have purposes. Nothing in the inanimate world has a purpose. So when we see things that do have a purposeful design, we can conclude that there are minds behind them. And again, the mousetrap is a good example. Another example that I routinely point to is Mount Rushmore, where even if you had never heard of Mount Rushmore before, you could immediately tell just from the shape of the rocks and how the pieces of it fit together into faces that it was purposely arranged. That's simply how we conclude that there are other minds besides our own in the world. And so I have written that we can conclude firmly from the purposefulness and the complexity and sophistication of the very foundation of life that it was intelligently designed.